Welcome into the Big City Sports Podcast. This is another episode coming at you. And how good are the Chicago Bears? That's going to be our first topic of discussion today. The Bears are in full possession of first place in the NFC North. And this is something that a lot of Bears fans thought could have happened, but not a lot of people in the media thought the Bears had the talent to put it all together this year. So the Bears are a first place team. They're 5-1. It hasn't been pretty, but they are in first place. Swig, welcome in. What do you think of the Bears and how good are they?
Oh my goodness, man! The Bears keep proving me wrong. I mean, now the win over Carolina isn't necessarily a surprise, but I definitely did not expect them to be 5-1 at this point. They've grinded out these ugly wins, and like Nick Foles said, yeah, obviously it's better to win ugly than lose pretty. There's no way I'm going to dispute that, but I still cannot believe they're in this position. They've won as many games as the NFC East teams combined, so I mean, there's got to be at least some sustainability here, especially with the Vikings being suddenly terrible and the Lions being their usual selves. It's looking like a legitimate two-team race in that division.
And the defense seems to be back. They took a year off last year, for lack of a better term. And Eddie Jackson returned to his normal position. You have Deshaun Gibson come over. So I thought that played a big role. And plus, Khalil Mack is looking ferocious again. He's had some big games. And I think that defense is finally putting it all together, even without Eddie Goldman this year. I thought the defenses looked good. Nick Foles is a great person for this team because he has the experience and he's good with a team like this. And I've been preaching it since he got the job. The offensive line has to keep him upright. If they do a good job of doing that, Nick Foles is going to succeed. He's someone that's been there and done that. And I think he can be the leader for that team. You saw his leadership in the post-game press conference, and he's someone that can really take the reins for this Bears team and hopefully get him over the top.
It is possible, man. I mean, Nick Foles has been good enough to win the games. And frankly, that's the only thing that matters at the end of the day. So, no argument there. I do still think there are some severe limitations with this team. Now, at this point, I'm not going to say that it's going to keep them out of the playoffs because that seems unlikely at this point, or that it can't even get them a playoff win or two. We've seen similar situations with a defense carrying a team pretty far. The 2010 Jets, for example, with Mark Sanchez, defense got them all the way to the AFC Championship game, or more recently, the 2017 Vikings with Case Keenum as the quarterback. There were some limitations. Defense mostly got them all the way to the NFC Championship in that season as well. So I do think it's possible that something like that could happen for the Bears, but there are still a ton of limitations on that offense. The offensive line has been bad. Let's be realistic here. Call a spade a spade. Leno Jr. and Rashad Coward, to me, have been the two biggest issues on that offensive line. The running game has still been pretty non-existent, and the more I watch David Montgomery on film, the less I believe in him. I'm just not seeing enough there at this point. But as limited as the offense is, with Allen Robinson as the one main playmaker, that defense is legitimate. I will say that right now. Khalil Mack has been great. Akeem Hicks deserves a ton of credit as well. Always one of the most underappreciated players in the league. And they're getting some big contributions on all levels of the defense from guys with mixed experience levels. We're seeing guys like Jalen Johnson step in and have an impact as a rookie. And Tashawn Gibson's been an outstanding pickup for them, as coming over after his stints in Jacksonville and Cleveland. So there are some factors I do think are sustainable for that defense.
Yeah, Tashawn Gibson has been a ball hawker his whole career. He has great interception totals for his career, and I think he was the right fit for that defense. You mentioned Hicks, and he missed last year with injury for some of the year, and that could have paid a big price on how that defense went about things last year. And obviously, the quarterback play wasn't good. It probably isn't still good right now to get them, but you mentioned David Montgomery. And yes, we all know he isn't having the 100-yard rushing games, but that offensive line has a lot to say with that. He can't have any room to run. He's just dancing around the minute he gets the ball, which could be a bad thing because he develops bad habits without looking clearly at the holes when they're there. So maybe it's a little bit of both on that. I do think he's an underrated receiver. I think he can actually get it done out of the backfield. He's pretty decent in pass protection as well. So I think he is a capable three-down back, but hopefully the rushing totals will go up with the offensive line producing as well.
I think the offensive line's limitations are lowering his ceiling a little bit long term. I'm not trying to put all of the blame on David Montgomery, but what I have seen is the vision hasn't been great. He hasn't been decisive. And part of that is because he's forced to wait behind an offensive line that's already into the backfield before he gets the handoff. So, not trying to blame it all on him, but there are definitely some limitations of his own as well. I do like him in pass protection, and I think the receiving ability is underrated, like you said. I do agree with that aspect. But I do think the vision is going to be a severe hindrance for him long term. That's where he gives me a Rashad Jennings type of vibe right there. When, on the rare occasions where a hole is available, especially right up the middle, he doesn't seem to attack it. He seems to wait and try to make a bigger play outside instead of taking a solid 5 to 7 yard gain, for example. And that is something that needs to be fixed if he's going to be the viable 3 down starter long term. I don't think that would be ideal for the Bears' best interests if he's the best option to play all 3 downs.
They did sign Lamar Miller a few weeks ago to the practice squad, so maybe he gets a raise and will end up getting onto the active roster to maybe take some carries away from David Montgomery, especially if they continue to use him as much as they have. I don't like Cordero Patterson as a running back. I've been saying it from the start, especially the way Matt Nagy uses him. It just makes me want to punch the screen. But I think there's still some upside with Montgomery. He's still super young, but we can't sit here and talk about if he's doing good or bad because obviously he hasn't looked the best, and you have to just take that into full consideration. This guy's yards per carry aren't the greatest, and that's something that hopefully will get fixed. It's nice to see Cole Kmet finally get into the red zone. His first touchdown and first somewhat big game for the rookie, their first pick in the second round this year for Chicago. So Cole Kmet, maybe he gets a little bit of more playing time after that show today over Demetrius Harris, but Jimmy Graham still looked pretty good over there as well.
He has. There have been some flashes from Cole Kmet, absolutely. But the more I watch the offense, while the personnel is definitely a big part of the issue, I do think it's really fair at this point to question Matt Nagy's offensive ability because we're in year 3 under his era. We're 38, 40 games in to him as a head coach, and we are just not seeing any real improvement from the offense. I know there haven't been a ton of resources invested into it overall, but there's a lot of predictability with the offense, especially on running plays. And when they bring in Cordero Patterson, it's very obvious what they're going to do for the most part. You know what they're trying to do by bringing him into the game is get his speed involved. And then there's no real chunk plays either. We're seeing them nickel and dime it down the field. Part of that is because of Foles' limitations and because the offensive line cannot protect for more than 2.5 seconds. So I understand. I'm not blaming it all on him, but they're not getting any chunk plays down the field because Allen Robinson is the only proven weapon on that team right now. I don't think they're properly utilizing Komet as much as I didn't love the pick in the second round. I do think he has enough talent where you can maximize him. And I don't think they're using Darnell Mooney's speed enough either. He's been solid. I want them to get him more involved. He's shown the flashes. He's done a lot more than Anthony Miller has, for example. So I would like to see Nagy be more creative in getting those guys involved and trying to get some bigger plays down the field because eventually they're going to play a team that the defense will falter against just enough where they're going to lose a game 21-17 instead of win it. And when that happens, I'm afraid it could lead to a big downward spiral if they don't start to make some adjustments.
Yeah, Nick Foles actually throws a very good deep ball. It's something that he's thrown pretty well over his career. But the thing with that is the offensive line doesn't give him near as enough time to set up for something like that. So there might have to be some blocking changed up front. Maybe you send another tight end or a running back to block on those scenarios. But he has a great deep ball. It takes him a long time to wind it up, though. He's sitting back there, he's cranking, and he has one of the longest releases in the game. So it takes him a little while. I do think they should try to do something like that, but you can't have Nick Foles taking a big shot because he's very injury prone back there as well.
Well, he's going to end up taking a few big shots either way with the offensive line, unfortunately. It's not an ideal situation. Every quarterback, no matter how good the offensive line is going to take several big hits over the course of a game or over the course of a season. So, what they need to do is be more creative in making sure there are one on one matchups on the outside for either Robinson or Darnell Mooney on one side of the field. I think their best ways to do that with a bad offensive line when defenses start to stack the box against this bad offensive line. Try some play action or especially especially some RPO to draw the safety in just long enough to throw up a 50-50 ball on the sideline. That's the type of play that Allen Robinson especially can make a decent amount, and making just one or two of those plays a game can absolutely change a drive or change the outcome of the game entirely. So they just need to I know there's some limitations to work around, but there are simple enough fixes there that where they can at least try to, get deeper chunks, bigger plays down the field, and it would absolutely change the offense.
The best thing I saw from the Bears game was a 55-yard boot from Cairo Santos, putting it through the uprights. We haven't seen a kick that good since Robbie Gold. So, 55-yarder for Cairo Santos. Tip of the hat to you. But other than that, that wraps up the Bears today. We're going to transition over to the New York Jets. Here we are, another week, another loss. It seems like I've been saying that every single week, but if you're tuning in and haven't watched the Jets, you just come over here just to hear how they're doing. Nothing's changed because we've been saying the same things every single episode. But Le'Veon Bell has been cut. They've been using Frank Gore. They got the P. Ryan, the rookie. They're trying to get him involved as well. So they're trying to go with a youth movement. What do you think of the New York Jets right now?
I think it's very clear the Jets are tanking at this point. Otherwise, Adam Gase would have been fired a long time ago. The Jets' best case or best chance of getting the first overall pick is frankly to keep him around because he's overmatched. We've hit on him hard several weeks in a row, and that's nothing's really going to change there. So let's focus on something that has started to come out publicly, and that's the tension building up in that Jets organization. Losing 6 games in a row to start the season, and with this tough stretch coming up with the Bills, Chiefs, and Patriots as their next 3 opponents, 0-9 before their bye looks like the most likely scenario here. And there's not really many bright spots to speak of. Greg Williams, the defensive coordinator, the defense has been very undisciplined, has taken a ton of penalties, but he says that it's not all on the defense, essentially saying the offense has put them in some bad spots. He's not wrong. The offense has definitely caused some of the issues for them. But yeah, that type of tension where they're throwing each other under the bus and throwing other coaches under the bus here is the first sign of a team that's just about to collapse entirely if they haven't already. The Jets became the first team in the NFL shut out this season. Adam Gase's offensive reputation, anyone and still going to defend that at this point? They've scored 7 touchdowns in 6 games. The defense hasn't been much better, but they're keeping them around. So I understand the frustration building up here, but we are at a big crossroads for the Jets franchise here because if they fire him now, they might actually improve and win a couple of games, and that would be the most Jets thing to do going forward.
Yeah, and this is one of these scenarios where it takes a lot. You hate to see it because it destroys relationships, but the front office to the coaching staff, the coaching staff are getting into it. You have Greg Williams, a defensive minded head coach that's always been fiery. We've seen him on Hard Knocks multiple times. And Adam Gase with that offensive reputation that hasn't been producing anything. And you butt heads like that. But if you're trying to continue to lose to get Trevor Lawrence to New York, you have to keep them together and just let them pound it out. It's a terrible situation there, but it's something that should be looking bright if they end up getting the first overall pick with Trevor Lawrence. And the defensive penalties are just stupid. You saw a team like the Jaguars. They had a lot of big personalities on that defense, and they just got rid of them. And a lot of people were like, what are you doing? So they tried to build it back up, got rid of Jalen Ramsey, a loudmouth. They got rid of Dante Fowler, one of the most overexcited players in the league. And they basically just got out those personalities and went. Now, I do think the Jets can coach their issues if they have the right person giving them the advice there, because these penalties are just, they happen every week, and every single time it's just horrible.
Well, the Jets have a horrible roster top to bottom, and they've been ravaged by injuries as well, although that's been a theme around the league. So that's absolutely been a factor in their slow start, let's say, is the kind way to put it. But at the same time, nobody could have reasonably expected for them to win more than maybe 6 games going into the season. There are still a ton of obvious flaws, especially on the offensive line and the lack of skill position players. And over the last few months, we've seen the probably 2 most talented Jets besides Mekhi Becton go out the door, with Jamal Adams getting traded to the Seahawks, the one talented player on that defense, frankly, and Le'Veon Bell being released and signing with the Chiefs. So looking at what they have left, we're getting a solid performance out of Jamison Crowder, but frankly, who cares at this point? And Sam Darnold is not being put in a good position to succeed here. The trade rumor is going to be swirling around him because when the Jets get the first overall pick, if that does in fact happen, Darnold's gone. We all know that. And Joe Douglas is going to want to start over with Lawrence and build from there. But it's going to take a couple of years for Lawrence to get anything going too, with the lack of skilled position players, the lack of blocking, and a horrible defense. So realistically, they are still multiple years away from really starting to contend. There are a ton of problems, both in personnel and in personality. And we're starting to see the infighting between Gase and Greg Williams, which honestly, I'm surprised it took this long before Greg Williams mouthed off about something. So going forward, other than going 0-16, what exactly can you preach to the Jets fan base at this point, other than we're going to get a good draft pick and try to build from there?
I think there's still some positives to look at here. Now, I'm going to start with something probably poor, but it involves the team going 0-16. So if you lose out and get the number one pick, that's good. But if you really want to lose out, and I know there's a lot of veterans in that team that just they don't like losing. They've been in the league for a long time. I mean, if they signed with the Jets, what do they expect? But anyway, so there's a lot of veterans that do not want to win, or I mean, they do want to win, but they're not winning. Now, if you want to preach to them that this year is physically going to be a tank, I think what you need to do right now, or at least in the next week, you have to use this trade deadline to move Jamison Crowder. He's your only talented player on the roster. And I think you can honestly get rid of him and just regroup the wide receiver position, whether it's via the draft or free agency next year. You could probably get a second round pick for Jamison Crowder right now. I think you move him to someone like the Patriots if they want to go in division. I know Belichick doesn't like that too much. But I also look at a team like the Indianapolis Colts that's been banged up at the wide receiver position. You have Hilton, Paris Campbell's out, then you have Pittman coming back. So maybe they piece that all together. So I look at the Colts and the Patriots as potential buyers for Jamison Crowder, and you have a lot of draft picks coming in. You traded the picks for, you traded Jamal Adams for the first round picks, and you have two this year, two next year. And it's going to be nice. I mean, you have Trevor Lawrence and another first round pick. It's not like you're doing everything just to get Trevor Lawrence. You have two first round picks. So that's something very positive to look up for the Jets as well.
Well, that's the one thing about their rebuild that would be appealing to whatever coach they end up bringing in. It's, I'm sure, what they were selling on Joe Douglas after they hired him. What's the appeal of getting rid of Adams and selling high on him is that you can use those assets to more quickly rebuild the team. And we're seeing that to an extent with their opponent this week with the Miami Dolphins, who have stockpiled draft picks very well. We're starting to see some of them make an impact. The Dolphins started 0-6 or 0-7, I believe, last year, and we're getting blown out every game. But Brian Flores was, to me, a much better coach. You could see the Dolphins playing hard for him. They ended up winning 5 of their last 9 games. There was some progress. They had 3 first-round picks in the draft. And then we're starting to see some improvement for them this year. They blew out San Francisco, easily coasted to the Jets, and now they're a league average team. That's a solid turnaround in 1 year, and the foundation is definitely there for more improvement going forward. So the Jets can try to sell that. I do agree that if they're going to tank, they need to sell off any players they have left with any value. Jamison Crowder would be at the top of that list. I don't like the idea of trading Darnold in the middle of the season, but at the same time, if they wait until after the season, his value is going to be the same, if not worse, and they're going to get less for him. We could see it being similar to a Josh Rosen trade after they brought in Kyler Murray. They got a second rounder from Miami, and I guess that's one of their missteps in this rebuild. But stockpiling the assets allows them to make moves like that and be aggressive, and also affords them a little bit more flexibility when things don't work out. And no rebuild is going to be perfect, and the Jets is not going to be either. But they need to stockpile as many assets as possible if they want to speed up that timeline.
Yeah, I agree with you there. So transitioning from the worst team in the AFC East, and we're going to go with the best team in the AFC East just for a little bit. I know we don't talk a lot about Buffalo, but when they're the best football team in New York, you have to bring them up because this is a Chicago, New York podcast. So the Bills are rolling. They're looking pretty good. They did lose to the Chiefs tonight on Monday night, and Josh Allen didn't play his best football of the year as an understatement. He sailed some throws. It was the wet conditions, but being from Wyoming, I think he should be able to deal with that. Buffalo, they're a good team. What do you think of the Bills this year?
Well, the Bills are 4-2, but I do think that's a bit misleading to an extent. And they're kind of having the opposite identity as a team of what they've been the last couple of years. Their defense has been fantastic the last two seasons, and it has struggled mightily so far in 2020, especially against the pass. And that, again, injuries are definitely a part of that. We've seen almost all of their big contributors miss at least one game: Tre'Davious White, Matt Milano, Tremaine Edmonds, Levi Wallace. And then we've seen guys like Ed Oliver fight through injuries and haven't been quite as effective. So all of that has made an impact. But I go back watching them on film. Now, I haven't had a chance to go watch the all 22 on the Chiefs game because that just ended a couple hours ago before we recorded this and isn't available yet. But the Bills have played a ton of zone coverage with great success over the last couple of years under Leslie Frazier, that defensive coordinator. And this year, they've been playing more man. It has not worked out, especially with guys like White and Levi Wallace missing time at the corner position, forcing Josh Norman to play outside where he's been a liability. And one other factor that I don't think is being talked enough about is the Bills run a base nickel defense rather than a 3-4 or a 4-3. So, meaning that their slot corner is on the field almost every single snap. And the main slot corner for the Bills this season has been Teron Johnson. He has been absolutely torched all season by slot receivers. We see offenses moving their best players inside to get one-on-one matchups against him across the middle of the field because he cannot keep up with them. And going into this Chiefs game and going into the game last week, the Bills have been forced to bring up corners from their practice squad. We've seen Cam Lewis play pretty well when he's come in. I think he should be given the number one opportunity to play slot once White and Wallace are back on the field. But they've had some struggles against the pass all season, and then they got torched against the run by the Chiefs tonight. Yeah, a team not known for running the football had 250 against them on the ground. So there are some worrying signs about them on defense rather than offense.
Yeah, that offense has been really good. You did a great job talking about the defense. I'm going to talk about the offense for a little bit. Josh Allen has had a pretty good year this year. He's looked phenomenal, both running and throwing the ball. And I think bringing in a guy like Stephon Diggs was massive for that team because, sure, John Brown was a pretty solid wide receiver one for that team last year. But if you move him to a two with his deep threat ability, it only makes Stephon Diggs in that offense so much better. And one thing last year, Devin Singletary looked really good on the ground. He emerged out of that backfield with a lot of veterans there. TJ Yeldon was buried on the depth chart there. And I think Devin Singletary, they're trying way too hard to get Zach Moss and Singletary accustomed to what they're doing. Now, Moss just came back. He played the first 2 weeks, missed some time, and he came back this week. But I still think they're trying to mix too much of that in. I think Singletary needs to be given the keys and run the football, and they need to start using the run game more because Allen's arm's going to fall off as much as he's throwing it.
Well, Josh Allen is still the most important player on the Bills, without question. And he has absolutely improved a lot since his first 2 years in the league. Yet he has been a lot better in terms of his decision making, protecting the ball. He's making bigger plays downfield. Part of that is because he has Stephon Diggs on the roster, which gives him a legitimate threat that he hasn't really had the last couple of years, and also gives guys like John Brown and to a lesser extent maybe a Dawson Knox more room to operate, and especially Cole Beasley. I'd say he could be the biggest beneficiary of all of that offensively. But overall, I do think there are some limitations if they keep using that running back tandem, because I think the Bills envision long term having them as a 1-2 punch. And I don't think that that's necessarily bad. As much as I like Devin Singletary, I do think he has a limited ceiling to an extent where I don't know if I'd like to see him as a 3-down back or a short yardage back type of situation. But for now, I don't think Zach Moss is ready. And giving him as many carries as they have is also not going to be as good for Singletary. It's going to limit his effectiveness. So I do think that they are over integrating Moss into that offense as a rookie. I know they want to get him some reps, but I think it would be better to have him more be a substitute back rather than a featured part of the offense. And then one other thing I did want to mention about the defense: we cannot overestimate the impact of Star Lotulelei opting out of the season. We know how good he can be, especially against the run. So his opt-out has absolutely been a factor in their struggles, and especially tonight in their game against Kansas City, not stopping the run. But overall, the Bills Bills haven't lost a ton on defense from what they've had the last couple of years. They don't have Shaq Lawson anymore. They don't have Lorenzo Alexander, who retired after a very good career. But outside of that, everyone else is back. They brought in guys to reinforce the defense, drafted AJ Epinesa in the second round. So there isn't enough of an excuse here for there to be this much of a drop off on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, and even with all these issues, I still think they're the division winner in the AFC East. I think they are a team that's very good right now. You got the Patriots are third in the division with Miami's win. So the Dolphins are number two. And I think the Bills, as long as they can fix these issues, get some players back like Tre'Davious White, that guy is a massive player for that team. He's a very good corner. If they can get these players back, I think the outlook's good for the Bills. They can end up probably winning the division, but definitely a playoff spot.
They should absolutely win this division. I'm not trying to say that the season is over, the sky is falling, or anything like that. And they are fortunate with New England finally seeming to take some of a step back. And I don't think Miami is going to be a huge threat for this season. I do think they have a ton of talent going forward, but I don't think they're going to keep beating teams like San Francisco by 25. So their division is absolutely there for the taking. We all know the Jets are not a factor in that division, and they need to start, correcting, getting back to their solid defense, disguising coverages like we've seen them do so well the last couple of years. They can still win this division very easily. The path is very obvious. They need to take care of business in the division games once those start coming up. But they also need to get the iron out these kinks now, because if they don't in the next couple of weeks, it is very possible that they could be passed for that division lead.
I agree with you. I think they just got to control what they can control, go out there and execute, and I think they could really stick to it. And they got to get better on defense. We're going to talk about the Islanders today. We haven't talked about them a lot because of our Chicago Blackhawks and Rangers fandom, I guess. We've been talking a lot about them and not so much about the Islanders, who have had a good year. A few games from the Stanley Cup, and we look at what they've done so far in the offseason and the draft. And I think they've done a pretty solid job. They traded Devin Taves. You got 2 first-round picks there. It helps out the cap space, I think. They haven't made too many aggressive moves yet, mainly just minor league deals. What do you think of the New York Islanders?
The Islanders had a fantastic season overall, and they had a fantastic performance in the bubble, almost making it to the finals, like you said, before eventually losing to the Lightning in 6 games. They deserve a lot of credit, especially for their defensive structure, but I think they have not had a very good offseason overall. Devin Tays got them 2 second-round picks back. And I get that, but the fact that they had to trade him in the first place shows some issues with their organizational structure, I think. The flat salary cap in the NHL is definitely part of the reason as well. And the Islanders have the 2 big restricted free agents that they have to find a way to keep, in Matt Barzal and Ryan Pulak. And I completely understand that. But the fact that the Islanders have given out these regrettable contracts to guys who just don't contribute enough or haven't contributed at all force them into that situation in the first place, force them to not have the cap space to keep an important player like that. Looking over the last couple of years, Andrew Ladd is one of the worst contracts in the entire NHL. A deal that even the most optimistic Islander fan knew would be a problem when it was signed. 7-year contract that they are stuck with for the duration. He is obviously not worth that money. To a lesser extent, we're seeing guys who play on the third and fourth lines getting 3 or 4 million that they're going to be stuck with. Matt Martin, Casey Zizekas to an extent, Cal Clutterbuck here, Leo Komarov, I think, is a great example. And then they're stuck with guys on the back end like Johnny Boychuk as well. The Islanders got rid of Tays and got a couple picks back, but they've also mismanaged their draft picks. They did not have a first or second round pick in this year's draft because they traded him for John Gabriel Pageau. And we can debate if that one's worth it. But they also traded their second round pick in 2021 for Andy Green. And overall, I just don't know if that's worth the investment for an aging defenseman. He's better than Boychuk at this point in his career, but is that really enough? I don't think so. So we're seeing these veteran guys who bring little to the team being overvalued and forcing the Islanders to get rid of young, valuable players, especially Tays so far. And he's not going to be the last casualty.
Yeah, and Andy Green, you mentioned, he's going to be 38 years old in 2 weeks. That's a very aging defenseman. They actually re-signed him, so he's back on the team. And I think you touched on how they brought up keep signing. They signed Matt Martin, and they keep going with these poor third checking line players that are up in age. I thought they should have made a move for an Evgeny Dadonov this offseason. I thought he was someone that could have fit their roster pretty well, gave them more scoring. We talked about how they play a more defensive style of game. I thought Dadonov could have added scoring to that team, but they elected to go with the veteran presence of someone like Matt Martin that's been there and done that.
Well, Dadonov, I love, and he got a solid contract. But the one big difference you'll see, he ended up signing with the Ottawa Senators, one of the very few teams in the NHL with cap space. The Islanders had no way to bring a guy like Dadonov in. They have less than 9 million on the cap at this very moment. Now that could change when Boychuk, who will probably get traded at some point, but they're going to have to attach an asset to get rid of the last 2 years of his contract, similar to what the Rangers did with Mark Stahl, for example. And they would have to do the same thing if they managed to find a taker for Leo Komarov's contract. They are very fortunate that nobody in the NHL really has cap space. Otherwise, somebody would have given Matt Barzal an offer sheet. I guarantee it. It would have forced their hand, similar to what Sebastian Aho got from the Montreal Canadiens a couple years ago. It's a rarely used move, and the only reason the Islanders weren't forced to make a very difficult choice is because no team outside of Ottawa or maybe the Devils has the cap space to force their hand like that. But because they're overvaluing guys who don't bring enough to the team, they lose Devon Tays, who was one of the best two-way defensemen in the entire NHL last season. He was great. His impact cannot be overstated there. He was a speedy puck-moving defenseman who played well on both ends of the ice. And being forced to trade him, not getting anything immediate back, it definitely raises some questions on their blue line, which was the strength of the team last season. They don't really, since they didn't have a first or second round pick in this year's draft, they can't expect any immediate reinforcements from their draft class either. And the only real prospect they have is Noah Dobson on the back end, and his development is going to be a huge key in how they replace Devontae's, but it's also a huge risk and a huge question mark that is not guaranteed to be resolved next season.
Now, let me ask you this. Even with, say, so Andrew Ladd's had a history of knee injuries. If he were to go on the long-term IR, would they have had enough cap space for 1 year of Dadonov?
They might have had enough because he's got a $5.5 million cap hit. He ended up signing $5 million a year in Ottawa, but at the same time, they can only stash him on long-term injured reserve for so long. And there's no way Dadonov's going to settle for a 1 year contract on a team like that. The Islanders are going to be forced to go bargain hunting. They got a great one with Derek Brassard last season, who played very well on a small contract, but they can't bank on things like that to happen every offseason. It's not a sustainable formula. They were forced to let Thomas Greiss go as well. Was a very solid goalie for them. So their goaltending depth is also been altered. They still have Semyon Varlamov. Ilya Sorokin's going to be the number two. And then they brought over Corey Schneider on a cheap contract after the Devils buyout for some depth. But they're forced to lose a couple of pieces that they otherwise could have retained if it weren't for these regrettable contracts. So I do want to point out, as good as they were this season, their mismanagement of the salary cap and their mismanagement of overvaluing certain guys on the roster could force their hand in terms of having a ceiling limited earlier and having a potential championship window close earlier, because they can only keep so many of these assets, and that window is not going to be open very long.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me how the Blackhawks had so many big contracts with Brent Seabrook, Duncan Keith, all these big aging players. And although they did get their cups, this is different for the Islanders. They came so close this year. Barry Trotz, I think, is the right guy for the job there. I wanted to bring up a name, Josh Ho-Sang. You think he's gone, or you think that he stays?
Man, he's got to be the biggest enigma on that team. I know that the Islanders get some attention for their coaching, and we see the high end talent that they do have that can carry them pretty far. Overall, I just don't see a long-term solution or a long-term relationship in the cards for Hosang and the Islanders. Part of that is I think they mismanaged that situation pretty terribly since he's come over. Overall, I think he's gone.
Yeah, I think so too. I don't think he sticks around. We're going to talk about the Mets a little bit. We haven't talked about them in a while either, because frankly, there hasn't been anything to talk about. It was a poor season for the Mets, but there were some bright spots. You had to think about it right here. Uh, Jeff McNeil was good again. It took him a little while to get going. He had a batting average over 300. The power was down, but it was a shortened year, so I think that gets fixed. Pete Alonso's average was down, but he did have, I think, 38 RBIs and 16 home runs, so that's good. Michael Conforto had a heck of a year, 322 and 9 homers. And we've talked about it before, breakout year for Dom Smith. And if the DH is here to stay, he's got to be someone in the lineup. He had led the team in RBIs with 42 and a 316 average with 10 homers. That's someone that can be a pivotal role for the Mets in the future. But I don't think if there's if there's not a DH, I don't think there's a spot for the team unless they stick him in left field.
I agree with the Dominic Smith point for sure. The Mets definitely had some bright spots, and I'm sure what any of their fans will say is the Wilpon era is finally over because he has been a disaster on course with the Hindenburg when he's been the owner of that team. So yeah, that's going to be a benefit for the Mets going forward. But they have a lot of questions as well in terms of their GM. Is Van Wagenen going to stay around? Are they going to keep Luis Rojas as the manager? There are some questions on the roster as well. So a couple more bright spots I do want to point out. The big one who hasn't gotten talked enough about to me is David Peterson, the rookie starting pitcher who played very well for the Mets, was the only real reliable guy they had after DeGrom in that rotation, after the Syndergaard injury and the Stroman opt-out. And we all know that Steven Matz and Rick Porcello and Michael Wacha just did not get the job done. The Mets in 60 games this season, 15 of those, the starter failed to record at least one out in the fourth inning, meaning they got 10 outs or less in a quarter of their starts. And then we saw them have to bring guys like Gazelman and Lugo back and forth from the rotation to the bullpen, which only hinders both parts of that pitching staff. So, and then the other bright spot I wanted to point out was Andres Jimenez playing shortstop, eventually taking that job from Ahmed Rosario. The Mets really have a lot of issues in terms of what they value as little things like defense and base running. They screw themselves on the base paths more than any team in the league. And we start to see that with guys like Rosario, who got picked off to end one of their games. And their defense gave up or had the least amount of runs saved in their division and won a bottom five total in the league. So the talent is there on that team, but a lot of self-inflicted mistakes and poor pitching sunk them.
Yeah, and we saw it in the World Series, or at least the NLCS, I want to say. Base running and defense plays a big role. Mookie Betts had 2 robbed home runs. He had a nice catch. And you saw failure to tag up at third base for Marcell Ozuna cost them a run there and actually an out. Who knows what could have happened there. And then you had the double play when you had a guy on second and third with no outs. So base running is still massive in baseball right now. It's you got to play all facets of the game. And I mentioned you mentioned Seth Lugo, and I mean DeGrom carried a rotation that basically was poor outside of him and Peterson. Do you think Seth Lugo is a long-term starter or reliever? Because he did flash in the rotation a little bit.
I think he could be a long-term number 4 or number 5 starter. I do think his upside is limited a little bit, and I don't know how much I trust his durability, but I think the Mets would be smarter to at least try to get something out of him as a starter, but they've waited a long time. They've wasted a couple of years of his career here, shuttling him back and forth when he's been one of their most effective pitchers. So they need to make a choice here. It kind of reminds me of what the Yankees did with Jabba Chamberlain back in the day. Started out as a reliever, tried him as a starter. They eventually ruined his career is the short version. And I could see the same thing happening with Seth Lugo on the Mets here. And then one other thing I want to touch on is the Mets offense. They had some great statistics if you just look at it that way. They led the majors in batting average. They were second in on-base percentage and fourth in slugging. Those are great numbers. You'd think that they would score a lot of runs. They were only 13th in runs per game. And a big part of that is because they hit very well when nobody was on base. And when runners were in scoring position or even just got on first base, they lost interest in plate discipline and driving in runs. And that sunk them. They lost a lot of winnable games as a result of their failure to score with runners on bases and in scoring position. So what fix do you sell to the team? How do you address that going forward? Because you should not be top 5 in the 3 most important categories offensively and only in the middle of the pack scoring runs per game.
I think there's a new owner in town. He's ready to spend some money. There's some holes on this team. But before I talk about that, I'm sick of everyone from the Mets and New York saying how bad Edwin Diaz is. Look at what he did this year. Outside of his few blown saves early on in the year, that guy was nails down the stretch. That guy, he had an ERA of like 169 this year. It was sub 2. He was phenomenal. I mean, that guy, I mean, he's a good relief pitcher, and he's still controllable on his arbitration right now. And he's someone that should be getting more credit than what he has because he's looked phenomenal. Now, to address their needs, I think they need a center fielder. They've needed one for the longest time. I think George Springer makes a lot of sense. Maybe Starling Marte if the Marlins decide to decline that option, which I doubt. But I would love Starling Marte to the Mets. I thought they should have traded for him. But so I think center field, catcher. I think they're definitely. I would be shocked if JT Realmuto isn't a New York Met. I think that
Hmm.
Real Muto ends up with the Mets, and if you can get someone like a Springer, at least someone that can play capable center field, I think you're in good shape at competing next year.
Well, that would absolutely do a lot to address their defense. And you mentioning catcher is a great example of why they struggled so much defensively. Wilson Ramos was their primary catcher. That was a great example of them valuing offense over defense. And while Wilson Ramos absolutely can handle the bat better than most catchers, I don't think anyone would argue that. His defense leaves a lot to be desired. And you see the little things, yeah, what they call the little things in terms of wild pitches and base runners advancing when they shouldn't, leading to some runs eventually scoring. And it makes the difference in a close game like that. George Springer would be a great fit for the Mets, of course, but I'd be shocked if he ends up there. I think Real Muto is a lot more of a realistic target. I don't think Starling Marte is going anywhere either. The Marlins, I don't think at least, would have traded for him if they just wanted to decline the option. Because as much as they had a better season than anyone expected, I don't think using him as a rental is a great idea long term. The Mets. Spending money has never been the issue. They've always been willing to spend. Their problem is they haven't spent it very wisely. In my lifetime, I can remember outside of the Bobby Bonilla infamous buyout, when they brought in Jason Bay, for example, he had some great years with the Pirates and then was a complete flop. And the warning signs are usually there on the players that the Mets bring in. Jed Lowry might be the best recent example. So they need to start valuing the right guys, younger players, preferably with upside. And for the most part, they go for these veteran guys who have reached their ceilings. The Mets need to start having a smarter long-term approach. But in the city of New York, that's just usually not the case with impatient fan bases.
Yeah, I think it's weird because you talked about how the Mets don't value defense. But I tell you, one spot they overvalue it. I don't know if you should say over because it's very important. Center field. So if it's going to be a New York Mets offseason, they're going to bring in a right-handed uh, fielding and hitting center fielder that cannot hit, that can play defense. So we have Juan Lagares, we have Jake Marisnik. You tried Billy Hamilton. Like, how many guys are you going to try without locking down a legit center fielder? That's why I think they should have traded the house to get Starling Marte. That would have been a beautiful fit there. Leadoff hitter, speed, defense, bat, everything you need there. And I think center field, you need someone that can contribute there. And maybe you make a trade to an Oakland team that might tend to a rebuild. I've done some research on their roster. They have a lot of players coming up. Maybe you go get a Ramon Laureano. I think he's a great fit there, but he's still controllable too. So maybe you make a move. Last thing about the Mets, you mentioned Luis Rojas. Will he be the manager next year?
I think he gets one more year if Van Wagenen is retained, with Cohen coming in as the new owner. But if one goes, the other is going as well. So I think it's going to be a bit of a wait and see approach there before I make a definitive statement. But I say he only stays if they give Van Wagenen another shot.
Yeah, so that's gonna wrap up our Mets today. That was fun talking about them. I hope we get to talk about them again a little bit in the future. They're an interesting team to dive into. There's a lot of topics to talk about, as always with a team like that.
They're
But
nothing if not entertaining.
yeah, for sure. We're going to transition over to the Chicago White Sox. Rumors have struck the world that Tony La Russa might be interviewing for a job with the Chicago White Sox. And LaRussa is someone that has a lot of baseball wisdom. I don't know if he's the right fit for someone in today's game with the amount of swagger on that team. With Tim Anderson, you have Luis Robert, all these guys that are just flashy players and love the game of baseball. I don't think that meshes well. What do you think of LaRussa?
Well, I do want to say I think long term, I don't hate the move to let Rick Renteria go. I'm a little surprised they did let him go with the 1 year left on his contract, but I think some of the warning signs were there in hindsight. We saw Dallas Keuchel talk about players not being held accountable enough, and Jose Abreu admitting to the team relaxing a little after clinching a playoff spot. So some of that is on the coaching or the managing in baseball. But in terms of Tony La Russa, I mean, were Connie Mack and Casey Stengel not available? I don't like the idea of bringing in a 76-year-old guy who hasn't managed full time since 2011 for a very young and young impressionable team for the most part. I think they would be better off going for somebody younger who could better get the most out of the emotions of that team. So I don't think it's a bad thing the White Sox are a fun loving team that enjoys themselves on the field. I think you should embrace that with whatever manager you hire. And Tony La Russa is going to be like fitting a square peg into a round hole.
I'm gonna use a line from Moneyball here. Now we're gonna discuss what the White Sox should do, or at least right now. And if a ball's hit the first base, no one's there to field it. So are we gonna talk about the players first, or are we gonna talk about getting the manager figured out? So we're gonna talk about the manager right now. And I got four people I think would be ideal fits for the White Sox, and I'm gonna put them in order. I think these are just great managers to bring into a situation like this that have had experience. Number one, AJ Hinch. This guy, I mean, say what you want about him with the Astros situation. He stood up for his players. He stood up for him and everything. Or no, he didn't stand up. He basically said, yeah, they cheated, blah, blah, blah. He admitted. He admitted is what I'm trying to get out. So I think AJ Hinch, he has the track record. I think he's a phenomenal manager for the job. AJ Hinch, number one. Number two, Buck Showalter. Buck Showalter is a veteran manager. He knows how to handle emotions. I think he'd be a great fit in Chicago. Number three, former player AJ Pierzynski. Let's bring back a catcher. I think that's someone that could take over a managerial job like that. And number four, this might be a stretch, but I think I'd give a look to Clint Hurdle.
Very interesting there. So I'll go one at a time here. AJ Hinch was actually the first guy I thought of as well that would be a good fit for the job, as much as I don't love the whole handling of the Astros situation. That's a different discussion there. But I do think standing up for your players and deflecting blame onto yourself is a great quality to have in a manager. Similar logic, my second thought was Alex Cora. If he doesn't end up back in Boston, I think he could bring a similar approach there and be a little bit more modern and revolutionary with how he uses his pitchers. I think there were points where Rick Renteria did use the analytics well, and other times where it would have been better to be managing more on feel, more on intuition. I think Cora has got a better mix of those two attributes. AJ Pierzynski, my goodness, we know the logic of former catchers being managers. There are several examples in major leagues right now. You have David Ross for the Cubs, Joe Girardi for the Phillies, etc. Pierzynski was not exactly the most popular player in the league when he played, and I do worry that let's say his dickish demeanor would not mesh very well with the White Sox current roster, because I guarantee you a couple players on that team would hate him. And overall, Clint Hurdle, I wouldn't love. I do think Buck Showalter, if you're going to go the manager or the veteran route, would be a much better fit for that team. We've seen him succeed with several different types of rosters, both with the Yankees back in the 90s and more recently with the Orioles. I think he could work similar magic with Chicago.
Yeah, I think that's something to keep an eye on. And we talked about Aaron Boone and his scenario about getting him out of town, or at least thinking about a managerial switch. And I thought if you were going to hire a manager, last year was the year to do it. If you're going to give up on your guy, you should have done it last year, because you had Mike Matheny sitting out there, Joe Girardi was out there, Joe Madden was out there. So you had three very capable, and even Joe Espada, he might get some looks now. He was that Astros bench coach that interviewed for a lot of jobs. I think Espada is a good managerial fit, maybe to a team like the Tigers or someone that's looking to build up. So we talked about the managers. Let's switch over to the field. So Nomar Mazara, right field, is an issue, and the starting rotation is the issue. What do you think about the White Sox and how they should go about those areas?
Okay. So looking at the White Sox roster, I'm going to start with Mazara. I think he needs to go. We know that he was one of the few failed experiments. I think the White Sox to address right field will most likely end up bringing in a stopgap as a free agent. Maybe if Nick Markakis gives it another run, I'd be surprised if he ends up in Atlanta. I think he could be an option. And then that starting rotation, we see some talent with guys like Giolito and Dane Dunning. We'll see what happens with Dylan Cease. I think he's kind of an interesting wild card as well. But if one of the Yankee pitching starting pitchers ends up making it to free agency, James Paxton, Masahiro Tanaka are both free agents right now. We'll see if one or both of them are brought back. But if they are not, I'd be shocked if one of them doesn't end up in the White Sox rotation. They would be a perfect fit there. They would be perfect buy low candidates, low risk, high reward for them at that point. And then in the bullpen, they also need to find a way to replace Alex Colomé, who's going to be a free agent after the season. They have a couple of reliable bullpen arms, but most of the guys that they have in the system right now, besides that, guys like Garrett Crochet, they're younger, unproven guys. I think they're going to want to bring in at least one veteran bullpen arm who can give them important late innings as well.
Yeah, Steve Cishek was a name that was a veteran they brought in last offseason. He pitched from the Cubs, and he didn't have the best year. He ended up getting released before the playoffs. So I think they will do their research on bringing in some depth in the bullpen. I think that should be their third priority because you could always address that at the trade deadline. So I would probably lean rotation, right field, and then go to the bullpen. But I think of another name. Now, this guy spent 1 year with the White Sox and he'd be making a reunion here. Now, I don't think he'd be the greatest fit, but maybe if you're looking for someone cheap and just another arm, you could even move him to the bullpen, maybe long relief. This is a guy that grew up right by the Chicago, south side of Chicago, uh, White Sox fan all the time. Jeff Samardzija. I think you bring him back to the White Sox, maybe as like a fifth starter or someone that you put into the bullpen. He gives you innings, and he hasn't had the best year the past couple of years, but he's someone that I think could maybe help out that team, or maybe even John Lester crosses town.
Ooh. Yeah, Samardzija would be an interesting buy low candidate. Yeah, he would definitely be a lower risk, high reward thing as long as the White Sox are smart enough not to invest too much in him. They're going to have options to fill out the back end of that rotation. We'll see what they end up doing in terms of their free agent approach. But one thing that we should mention, during the White Sox segment here is Rick Hahn won the Executive of the Year. Weirdly enough, I know we've who have been pumping the brakes on how quickly he should try to accelerate the rebuild. But yeah, he was started off, Rick Renteria and Don Cooper, the pitching coach, both gone, and he immediately prefaces the speech by saying it wasn't because of what happened in Game 3 against Oakland, which I found interesting. He got defensive before he could get interviewed. So, but Rick Hahn clearly has the big picture in mind for the White Sox. They're going to start being aggressive next year. We know that at this point. They need to find that balance, but they also need to just make sure that they are addressing the biggest needs on that team. And I would agree that the rotation is that number one priority. We see it, with teams who don't have more than one reliable starting pitcher, they're not going to advance very far in the playoffs.
I think a great name that is now retired that would have fit really well with the White Sox right now would have been Melky Cabrera. How about him in right field? That'd have been a switch hitter, someone that's played for the White Sox. I thought that could have been a good fit for them. And another thing that we're not talking about yet is James McCann. This guy's a free agent. He's a personal catcher for Giolito. Do you think there's any scenario where they trade Yasmani Grandal to sign James McCann back? Because if so, that would look very bad on the hands of Rick Hahn.
Yeah, I don't see Rick Hahn swallowing his pride that quickly. I mean, we still know Yasmani Grandal has a lot of value, but James McCann is going to get starting catching money in free agency from somebody. We know that. It's just not feasible to me that the White Sox will keep both of them around. They can't have too much invested in one position, and they can. They're just not going to get the return on investment if they do trade Grandal after one season. So I do not think that's a possibility.
I think James McCann to the Angels would be nice. Get him to get that rotation just a little bit more help, steal them a few strikes because boy, do they need it.
Yeah, he'd be a good fit in Los Angeles. And we all know the Angels are always willing to spend money that usually doesn't get them any more wins, like Albert Pujols or last year Anthony Rendon. But, they need to get Mike Trout in the playoffs eventually. So maybe he'd be a part of that.
Yeah, so that's going to wrap that up. But one more note, the news from Monday is that Doc Emmerich, the voice of NBC has announced his retirement. Fidelio, he's a guy that got his start at a very young age. He actually wanted to start calling baseball he was from Pittsburgh, big or not from Pittsburgh. He's a big Pirates fan, and he wanted to call baseball, but he had an encounter with the Fort Wayne Comets in the ECHL, and he was actually mentored by Bob Chase, the late great radio voice of the Fort Wayne Comets in the East Coast Hockey League, and a great career for Mike Emmerich, one of my all-time favorites that has just called games. And whenever he's calling games, you have to assume it's big and it's hockey.
Absolutely. He'll definitely be missed as the voice of NBC. We always know him for his colorful vocabulary, waffle boarding a save, or, the paraphernalia, some words that you don't hear very often, So, you don't expect a hockey game to turn into a thesaurus, but I mean that as a compliment. Always, brought excitement and colorful language to really bring the game alive, make it pop off the screen. So he will definitely be missed.
All-time favorite call from Doc Emmerich. I'll do one, and if you have one, you could share one. But it's got to be the Blackhawks winning the cup, right? 2 seconds and one. The Chicago Blackhawks have won the Stanley Cup.
Well, I won't do impressions because I'll accidentally offend somebody. But no, my favorite. Yeah, I know a little biased here as a Ranger fan. In 2015, when the Rangers beat the Capitals in the second round, coming back from a 3-1 deficit, his call when Derek Stepan scored the overtime winner in Game 7 was definitely the one that stuck out to me. It just hype. Yeah, I was already hype enough. Yeah, I could finally breathe again after a couple of hours. But the face tied up, one back to Yandel, drive by Girardi, and then when Stepan scored, I will never forget it. It just captured the feeling in the Garden perfectly.
Yeah, he was awesome. He's always brought excitement, especially the Winter Classic. He had the scenario with what was it, the Penguins game where Crosby wins it in overtime. That was iconic as well. I'd like to see Kenny Albert step into that job. You've seen Marv Albert do NBA on NBC back in the day. How about Kenny gets hockey for that? That'd be really cool for that.
Yeah, if Kenny gets that job, I'll miss him when he does the radio for the Rangers, or steps in as TV for the Knicks sometimes. And Mike Breen does national, but Kenny Albert's proven he can call any sport and call it well. So it'd be a well-deserved opportunity.
Yep, that's going to wrap it up for us today. Please click subscribe and comment on what our posts below. Follow us on social media. We send stuff out on there and show previews of episodes, so make sure you stay tuned there. And we'll see you next week.